What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back, and it's finally time for the highly anticipated band versus band video. So yes, I put out a video back around mid-January asking suggestions from you guys on band versus band matchups. Pretty much got inspired to do this thanks to my boys over at the Thralls of Metal, Nick, John, Joe, Ryan, and Miller, as they did band versus band and album versus album videos. Eventually, we're going to do an album versus album video at some point here this year, but not sure when. So I figured starting off with band versus band would be very interesting because, you know, time to make some difficult choices when it comes to like my tastes in music. So without further ado, let's not waste any more time and let's get started. So we're going to start off with quite a bit of a list, courtesy of Horror Master, my buddy, my boy Ricky from the Horseman podcast. He has quite the list. I'm going to go through them all, but I have to say, as much as I love you, dude, fuck you for a couple of these. So starting off, My Dying Bride versus Paradise Lost. Ugh. I know these are two of your favorite bands, but I'm going to go with Paradise Lost, only because I've listened to them more than I've listened to My Dying Bride. So some of these I do have to kind of go with who do I listen to more, or sometimes I have to go based on what I've heard or influence and whatnot. So for here, I'm going Paradise Lost. And this next one's a motherfucker. Death versus Opeth. Oh, man. And I love both of these bands so much for different reasons. I'm going to go with Death only on the principle that there wouldn't have been an Opeth without Death. So I'm going with the mighty Chuck. May he rest in peace. Next up, Overkill versus Exodus. Whew. This is another tough one because these are two all-time greats in thrash. By a tiny hair, I'm actually going to go Overkill. I find myself listening to Overkill more than I do Exodus. So, yeah, I'm going Overkill. Next up, Dark Angel versus Metal Church. That's easy. I'm going to take Dark Angel. I haven't listened to very much Metal Church in my life. Dark Angel, they are an incredibly underrated LA thrash band. Gene Hoglan, freaking fucking mastermind on the drums on those Dark Angel albums. Next up, Powerwolf versus Sabaton. Easy, I'm going Sabaton. I've not listened to Powerwolf, so by default, I'm going Sabaton. Next up, we're going classic rock here. 38 Special or ZZ Top? ZZ Top. I mean, they still got some jams. And not to say 38 Special doesn't have jams. I just prefer ZZ Top more. Next up, ooh, you're getting prog on me. Rush versus Genesis, in quotation, Peter Gabriel era. While I do enjoy the Peter Gabriel material of Genesis, I'm still going to go with Rush. I just like Rush's music a little bit more. And Rush, you can argue, is a forefather in prog metal as well, given their stuff in the 70s was heavy for that time. So yeah, I'm going Rush. Next up, we got Dissection versus Dismember. Oh, begrudgingly, I'm going to take Dissection, only because I need to dive further into Dismember. And Dissection, short-lived band, but first two albums, absolute classics in bridging that gap between black metal and melodic death metal. So yeah, I'm going Dissection on this. Next up, oh man, Opeth or Edge of Sanity. Oh. For this, I'm going to take Opeth just because I've been listening to them longer than I have with Edge of Sanity. So, yeah, I'm going Opeth. Next up, Watain versus Behemoth. Behemoth. I've not really listened to a whole lot of Watain, so... But when that new album comes out at the end of the month, or I think it's April, I forget. But when that album comes out, there's a good chance that I'll review it, so I'll get a real first impression on a full Watain album, so... But I'm still going to go with Behemoth, because, I mean, it's Behemoth. Next up, Arch Enemy versus Children of Bodom. Oh, I kind of look at it as like Angela era Arch Enemy versus early Children of Bodom, like the first 3-4 albums. Oh, that's tough, but I'm gonna go by a hair. I'm gonna go with Children of Bodom. Rest in peace, Alexi Leo. Next up, At the Gates versus The Haunted. At the Gates. I mean, after all, I mean, The Haunted, it's basically started out as a project from At the Gates. And so I have to go with the original At the Gates. The Haunted, they're kind of like an inconsistent band. It's like they run the risk of, or they run into that good albums, then a bad album, or mediocre, then a good album. But everything At the Gates is consistent, so I'm going At the Gates. Next up, Iced Earth versus Enforcer. I'm taking Iced Earth only because I've not listened to Enforcer, and Iced Earth's got some really good albums. Burnt Offering, Stark Saga, Horror Show, yeah. Next up, Carcass versus Death. Oh, man. Not an easy choice, but I'm going to go with Death. But I love Carcass, but I have to go with Death. Scorpions versus Accept. That's tough, but I'm going to go with the Scorpions, only because there wouldn't be Accept without the Scorpions. So, there you go with that. And then finally, Abath versus Isan. I mean, they're both great in their own right. Like, Abath is one of the metal spirit animals, and Isan's such a great musician. But based on their solo work, I'm going Isan. So, there you go. Thank you, Ricky, for your list. And just to keep in mind, some of these do come from Twitter and Instagram. So, next up, Melissa Alexander. Well, how's it going, lady? How's it going, beautiful lady? Next up, or her three choices. First, Misfits versus Green Day. That is easy for me. That is Misfits. Enough said there. I'm not the biggest Green Day fan, apart from Dookie and American Idiot. To me, Green Day's kind of eh. Next up, Ramones versus Sex Pistols. I'm going to go with the Ramones on that one. And then the final one, Death versus Slayer. Ooh. I mean, while I understand without Slayer there wouldn't be Death, I find myself listening to Death albums more than Slayer albums, so I'm going Death on this one. Alright, so those were Melissa Alexander's picks. Now for next two comes from Red Racer 1985, my boy James. How's it going, James Qualls? Going with some classic ones here. First, AC/DC versus Metallica. As much as I enjoy AC/DC, Metallica's was my gateway into all this, so I'm going Metallica. Sorry, AC/DC. Next up, Judas Priest versus Black Sabbath. Again, as much as I love Judas Priest, I have to go with Black Sabbath. On the principle there wouldn't be a Judas Priest without a Black Sabbath. So, thank you, James, for those. Next three comes from T. Regan 0. My Triple S, how's it going, ma'am? I miss you. But she has three. First off, Meshuggah versus Enslaved. That's an interesting matchup. Two prog giants, but in different styles of prog. But I'm actually going to go with Enslaved. I just find myself enjoying Enslaved more than I do Meshuggah. So I'm going Enslaved on that one. Next up, Gojira versus Tool. That one's more difficult because I do enjoy both bands for different reasons. However, by an inch, I'm gonna go with Tool. Yeah, that one kind of hurt. That one kind of hurt. Ouch. And then her final one, Possessed versus Slayer. I gotta give it to Slayer. After all, without Slayer, you wouldn't have Possessed. And Possessed is great. All three of their albums are fantastic. But again, Slayer is Slayer. Slayer! So those were from T. Regan Zero. The next one comes from The Dreadful Minutes. What's up, Rick? He just has one. And this is an interesting one. Swallow the Sun versus Hooded Menace. The battle of the two biggest Death Doom bands out of Finland. But completely different styles, you know. Swallow the Sun's more melodic Death Doom, and Hooded Menace is more of that traditional Death Doom. By a narrow margin, I'm going to go with Hooded Menace. I find myself listening to Hooded Menace more than I do Swallow the Sun. I know Ricky's probably going to kill me for that, but I'm going with Hooded Menace. The next one comes from Justine Fournier. How's it going, young lady? Oh man, I've been waiting on this one. Metallica versus Megadeth. Oh, man. Two of my all-time favorite bands right here. I'm gonna have to go with Metallica, just because I discovered them first. Then, if it wasn't for getting into Metallica, I probably wouldn't have gotten into Megadeth. So, I'm going Metallica. But don't worry, Megadeth, I love you too. Next one comes from Brian Arkham. How's it going, Brian? He just has one, and it is Merciful Fate or King Diamond. I mean, they're both fantastic, but when it and I love them both, but when it comes down to who I have to choose, I always go to the original, and that's Merciful Fate. King Diamond's the man, and I have to go with Merciful Fate. Even though King Diamond's got some very strong solo albums, when it comes down to it, I have to go with Merciful Fate. So, next 6 comes from They Call Me Jit. How's it going, dude? He asks, Anthrax versus Suicidal Tendencies. I'm going Anthrax, because I just find myself enjoying Anthrax songs more than I do Suicidal Tendencies. I enjoy Suicidal, but I have to go with Anthrax on this one. Next up, Pantera versus Lamb of God. Easy, I'm going Pantera. I enjoy Lamb of God, but there wouldn't be a Lamb of God without a Pantera, so I'm going Pantera. And then his next one, we have Mastodon versus Gojira. I feel bad for Gojira, they haven't won yet, but I'm going Mastodon. I mean, Mastodon, that's another one of my all-time favorites. I mean, it's Mastodon. Mastodon. Oh, here comes another one. Judas Priest versus Iron Maiden. Oh, one of the classic questions. I'm going personally, as much as I love Judas Priest, I'm going Iron Maiden. I've always been a bigger Iron Maiden fan than I am of Judas Priest, so I'm going Iron Maiden. Next up, Black Sabbath versus Led Zeppelin. I have to go Sabbath. I enjoy Led Zeppelin, but I prefer Sabbath over Zeppelin. And then his final one, AC/DC versus Motörhead. Ooh. I love you, Lemmy. I miss you, Lemmy. But I have to go AC/DC. Love Motörhead, but I love AC/DC as well. But by a hair, I'm going AC/DC. Next one from Cemetery Charles. How's it going, lady? Pretty lady. Oh, Typo Negative or Woods of Ypres? Honestly, I'm going to have to go Typo. Again, on the principle there wouldn't be a Woods of Ypres without a Typo Negative, and Typo Negative, one of the best consistent bands during the 90s and the 2000s. So yeah, I have to go Typo. I love you and I miss you, Peter Steele. Next two comes from Judith Zamola. Zamamola, yeah. First, now these are two interesting ones. Dio versus Slayer. I'm assuming you're meaning Dio solo albums. While I love Holy Diver and The Last in Line, I have those albums, but I got into Slayer first, so I'm going with Slayer. And then her next and her final one, Death versus Bathory. I have to go with Death. I first heard them before I listened to Bathory, so I'm going Death. Next four comes from Black Metal Duchess. Another beautiful lady. What's up? First, Marduk or Mayhem? I have to go Mayhem. Even though Marduk's cool, Mayhem. I mean, it's Mayhem. Without Mayhem, you probably wouldn't have had Marduk. So, there you go with that. Next up, Behemoth or Rotting Christ? I have to go Behemoth on this one. I mean, Rotting Christ's last two albums are fantastic, but I have to go with Behemoth on this one. Next up, Satyricon versus Dark Funeral. Ugh. I am going to go with Satyricon. Just for Nemesis Divina alone, I have to go with Satyricon. I actually need to get that album in my collection at some point. And then finally, Tiamat versus Paradise Lost. I'm going Paradise Lost, just because I've listened to them more than I've listened to Tiamat, so yeah, I'm going Paradise Lost. And now, we get into the nitty-gritty, the big long list from Space Metal Ferrari 248. What's up, dude? And you have quite the list here. I'm going to go through them all, but I'm going to say screw you for quite a lot of these. First off, Metal Church versus Riot. I haven't listened to much of either, but I'm going to go with Metal Church on this one. Next up, Sanctuary versus MANOWAR. I'm actually going to go with Sanctuary on this, just because like World Dane had a really killer voice, and may he rest in peace. So, yeah, I'm going with Sanctuary. Celador or MANOWAR? This time I'm going MANOWAR, just because don't know who Celador is. So, yeah, I'm going MANOWAR on that. Queensryche or Crimson Glory? Not listening to much Crimson Glory, so I'm going to go by default with Queensryche. Let me get a drink of water. Next up, we got Saxon versus Visigoth. I have to go with Saxon. I mean, Saxon is Saxon. Come on. Next up, Powerwolf versus Iced Earth. By default, I'm going Iced Earth. I've not listened to Powerwolf. So yeah, I have to go Iced Earth. Next up, Exodus or Testament. I have to go Testament. Again, I listen to more Testament than I do Exodus, so I'm going Testament. Next up, we got Possessed versus Death. I have to go Death on that one. Even though love Possessed, I prefer Death. Next up, Death versus Sepultura. Again, I have to go Death. Even though I love the Max era Sepultura stuff, and Quadra was a pretty good album, I have to go with Death. Next up, Sepultura versus Sarcophago. Now I go Sepultura. Though Sarcophago, first two albums and first EP are great, I prefer Sepultura. So, yeah. There you have it with that. Next up, Atheist versus Nocturnus. Oh, that's not fair. Ugh. just because... Oh, man. By a hair, just because they got the better debut and the better comeback album, I'm going Nocturnus. That one hurt. Next up, Sarcophago versus SOD. That is a weird matchup there. Two completely separate schools of thought, but... Ugh. I'm actually going to go with Sarcophago on this one, because, like I said, the first two albums and first EP are great. SOD, to me, only has one great album. That was the first one. Everything else is kind of eh, so I'm going to go with Sarcophago on this. DRI, or Suicidal Tendencies? Ugh. The battle of two of the godfathers of crossover thrash. By a hair, I'm going to go with DRI. Love Suicidal, but DRI, the album's crossover and thrash zone. Even though Suicidal, they got some killer stuff. Yeah, I'm going DRI by a tiny bit. Next up, Exhorter versus Annihilator. I'm going to go with Exhorter on that one. Sorry, Annihilator. Dark Tranquility versus Unleashed. Haven't listened to much of either, but I'm going to go with, just based on consistency, Dark Tranquility. Next up, Grave versus Bloodbath. Ooh. I'm going to go with Bloodbath on this. I prefer Bloodbath's music over Grave, so I'm going to go with Bloodbath on that. Next up, Bloodbath versus Morbid Angel. Oh, that one's more difficult, because I do love both bands for different reasons. However, I'm going to take Morbid Angel on this one. That one hurt. Next up, Morbid Angel versus Atheist. I'm going to take Morbid Angel on that one, too. Sorry, Atheist. Next up, Loudness versus Armored Saint. That's an interesting matchup. But I'm going to go with Armored Saint on that one. Wasp versus Loudness. I'm going Wasp on that. And then Dokken versus Loudness. I'm taking Dokken. I don't know that much Loudness. I know of them, and I've heard a song or two. But, yeah. Sorry, Loudness. Next up, Eternal Champion versus White Wizard. By default, I'm going Eternal Champion. I've not listened to White Wizard, and Eternal Champion's latest album's amazing. Visigoth versus White Wizard. Again, by default, I'm going Visigoth, even though I've only listened to a couple songs from Visigoth. I liked what I heard, so I'm going Visigoth. Next up, Hooded Menace versus Blood Red Throne. Oh, you're a dick. This is one of the most difficult ones so far. I am going to go by a bit. I'm going to go with Hooded Menace. I am so sorry, Blood Red Throne. I love you too, but... yeah, moving on. Next up, Carcass versus Dark Throne. That one's difficult. Begrudgingly, I'm going to take Carcass on this one. I love Dark Throne, but by a hair, I'm going Carcass. Next up, Carcass versus Sodom. That one's difficult too, but by a hair, I'm going to take Sodom. I love Carcass, but I think I like Sodom just a little bit more. Next up, Megadeth versus Sodom. I have to go Megadeth on that one. Next up, Incantation versus Immolation. The battle of the two ugly death metal bands, but I'm going to go with, by a bit, I'm going Immolation. Next up, Atheist versus Obscura. I'm sorry, Atheist, but I have to go with Obscura. I've been listening to Obscura longer than I've listened to Atheist, so I have to go with Obscura on that one. Sorry, Atheist, they didn't win one. Next up, Nile versus Suffocation. Oh, man. And they both have albums I love. But just because there's more songwriting, or like more adventurous stuff, I'm going to go by hair with Nile. I love Suffocation too, but by a bit I have to go with Nile. Death versus Pantera. By a bit, I'm going with Death. That one hurt. That one hurt. Armored Saint versus Warlock. I have to go with Armored Saint on that one. Dissection versus Mayhem. Oh, man. By a bit, I'm going actually with Dissection on this one. I just think that when it came to songwriting variety, there was more of that in Dissection's first two albums. So even though I love the first Mayhem album, I have to go with Dissection on this one. Coroner versus Heathen. I need to dig deeper into Heathen, so I'm going to go by default with Coroner on that one. Annihilator versus Mortal Sin. Annihilator's finally going to get a win on here, so I'm going to go with Annihilator on that one. Next up, Symphony X versus Wilderun. I'm actually going to take Wilderun on this one. That new album is fantastic. I still need to get it on CD at some point. But yeah, I'm going Wilderun on that. Now this next one sucks. This next one hurts. Opeth versus Mastodon. Oh, man. Oh. I feel like I'm dying on the inside on this. I'm just gonna quickly say, I'm going Opeth. I'm sorry, Mastodon, I love you, but Opeth, man. Baroness versus Mastodon. Now Mastodon on that one. I've not listened to much Baroness, so yeah. Accept versus Saxon. Ooh. I'm actually gonna take Accept on that one. Sodom versus Overkill. I have to go with Sodom on that one. I like their music just a little bit more than Overkill, so I'm going with Sodom. Next up, Demolition Hammer versus Cro-Mags. By a tiny bit, I'm actually gonna go with Demolition Hammer, personally. By a bit, I'm going with Demolition Hammer. And then finally, Borknagar versus Candlemass. Final one overall. And for this one, I am going to go with Borknagar. I enjoy Borknagar's music just a little bit more than Candlemass. I enjoy Candlemass, but I like that vocal style of Borknagar. It's just so great. So, yeah, that was all the matchups, and man, some of these were difficult. Some of them were pretty easy, all things considered. But, yeah, I thought this would go on longer than I thought it would, but managed to squeak about half hour out of this. But anyways, so based on everything I got to choose, who would you pick for a lot of these? Let me know in the comments section below. Yes, I will eventually be doing album versus album at some point. Not for a while. It's going to be a while before I do album versus album. But anyways, until next time, horns high, and I will see you soon.
I've noticed that once people hit Slayer, they're like, is there something more extreme than Slayer?
Yeah, it's the crossroad, you know. Either you're going like, okay, this is too much, or you're like, I need more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I found Cannibal Corpse on YouTube when I was 12 or 13 and heard the hammer smash the face bass solo.
Of course.
Of course, already then I was a bass player, but when I heard that, I was like, okay, that's what I'm gonna do. This is it. And then it just spiraled downwards from there.
And it just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it never stops.
Yeah.
It devours you.
Yeah, because